Audiences often imagine action films as carefully engineered machines, stories unfolding with mathematical precision, performances tuned to exact emotional beats, and productions guided by a clear, unwavering plan. But behind Hollywood's polished exterior lies a far more unstable truth. Many of its most celebrated action movies were created not through order, but through staggering disorder. Beneath the seamless rhythm on screen were countless days when no one, neither the actors nor the directors, could fully explain where in the story they were standing. Some of these films were carved out of weather that refused to cooperate. Others collapsed under shifting scripts, vanished locations, or actors whose schedules shattered the narrative into scattered pieces. Emotional arcs were performed backwards. Climaxes were captured before motivations existed, and entire storylines were stitched together long after the cameras stopped rolling. What looks coherent in the final cut was, on set, a maze of contradictions and frantic improvisation. Filmmakers fought through unpredictability, rewriting scenes in the margins of call sheets, rearranging performances that no longer matched the script, and trying to maintain a sense of narrative momentum when the shoot moved like a storm without a center. Actors found themselves delivering grief before joy, rage before revelation, and transformation before the moment of change had ever been filmed. It wasn't artistry alone that kept these films alive, it was survival. And yet, perhaps that is what makes these works so powerful. When chaos is pressed into shape, when scattered moments are forged into a single vision, the result is something strangely electric. Tonight, we step into the shadows behind those productions, the ones held together by instinct, stubbornness, and the sheer refusal to fail. This is the story of 15 Hollywood action films shot so wildly out of sequence that they almost collapsed under their own weight. Fact 1. Mad Max, Fury Road. Picture a film set where the emotional roadmap has dissolved, where actors step into frame without knowing which chapter of their character's psyche they're supposed to inhabit. That was the daily atmosphere on Mad Max, Fury Road. The Namibian desert, unpredictable and relentless, dictated the shoot more than any script ever could. Gusts of wind erased tracks, dunes shifted shape overnight, and equipment struggled against sand and heat. The production jumped between scenes meant for entirely different parts of the story, leaving the cast to navigate their roles without a sense of progression. Tom Hardy frequently questioned the direction, frustrated by what he perceived as a lack of clarity. Charlize Theron, too, found herself struggling to anchor Furiosa's emotional journey when the scenes that defined her arc were captured in no logical order. George Miller, juggling a mountain of scattered footage, held steadfast to his vision even as the schedule bent in every direction but forward. The continuity team fought to stitch emotional peaks and valleys into something resembling a coherent path, and somehow, through the disarray, the chaos became the film's heartbeat. When the fragments were finally assembled, the raw desperation and untamed intensity reflected the wasteland's spirit with uncanny precision. What should have been a cinematic collapse transformed into a masterpiece built from disorder. Would another film survive that kind of fragmentation? The next production faced its own battle, one where the script changed so rapidly the actors barely recognized the story from day to day. Fact 2. The Bourne Ultimatum. For a franchise defined by razor-tight choreography and psychological clarity, The Bourne Ultimatum was constructed in a fog of uncertainty. Paul Greengrass reshaped the script while cameras rolled, rewriting motivations, rearranging scenes, and discarding pages minutes before shooting them. Matt Damon found himself performing crucial moments without knowing whether they represented Bourne's early confusion or his final grasp on the truth. Emotional continuity became guesswork. Because the film spanned multiple countries, production had to seize whatever locations were available. This meant shooting endings before beginnings, climaxes before explanations. Major chases were filmed without the connective scenes that gave them meaning, forcing editors to reassemble the film like a broken mirror. Damon later admitted that he relied on instinct rather than direction to judge Bourne's mindset on any given day. The studio watched nervously, unsure whether the scattered footage could ever be shaped into something coherent. Reshoots added even more variations, each with different tones and emotional weights. Yet when the pieces were finally aligned, the disjointed process lent the film a sense of urgency and fractured identity that matched Bourne's inner turmoil. But if this production struggled under shifting pages and unpredictable geography, the next film faced a different dilemma. Two leads performing emotional climaxes long before their characters had even bonded on screen. Fact 3. Die Hard with a Vengeance. Die Hard with a Vengeance unfolds, with relentless speed, but behind the scenes, the production stumbled through its own maze. Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson filmed pivotal confrontations early, then returned to lighter introductory moments weeks later. Their characters' evolving rapport tense, reluctant, gradually cooperative, had to be rebuilt out of order, leaving both actors unsure which emotional note each scene demanded. John McTiernan dealt with a script that shifted constantly, originally conceived for an entirely different film. Entire sequences were rewritten overnight to accommodate new ideas or lost daylight. Some of the film's most explosive moments were captured before the narrative context that justified them had even been defined. Crew members relied on wardrobe changes and small visual cues to determine where in the story they were supposed to be. Despite the turmoil, the performances carried an unpredictable sharpness that echoed New York's chaotic pulse. The mismatched fragments created a tension that felt grounded and immediate. What should have been a tangled mess instead took on the energy of a city barely holding itself together. Yet this would hardly be the last time a franchise's emotional architecture was thrown into confusion. The next film demanded an even more delicate balance, one where a legendary character's entire emotional evolution had to be built from scenes shot in reverse. Fact 4. Casino Royale. The reinvention of James Bond in Casino Royale came with enormous expectations, but the making of the film unfolded with anything but stability. Because of strict location windows and unpredictable weather, Daniel Craig had to film some of Bond's most emotionally devastating scenes long before the narrative foundations had been laid. The brutal torture sequence, a moment meant to fracture Bond's psyche, was captured while Craig was still trying to understand the character's early innocence and guarded charm. Martin Campbell and the continuity team scrambled to track Bond's emotional evolution using charts, notes, and color-coded breakdowns. Yet the shoot kept drifting out of alignment. Intimate moments between Bond and Vesper were filmed after their darker exchanges. Early scenes were executed when Craig's portrayal had already deepened into something colder and more wounded. The emotional timeline became a puzzle without edges. In the end, the finished film appears seamless, its emotional arc steady and assured. But beneath that smooth exterior was an actor forced to piece together a psychological journey from scattered fragments, each demanding a different version of who Bond was becoming. And if Bond's identity was challenged by fractured chronology, the next production, dark, mythic, and dangerously dependent on one iconic performance, would be pushed even further into creative uncertainty. Fact 5. The Dark Knight. The legend of The Dark Knight often overshadows the disarray that shaped it. Heath Ledger's availability, coupled with Christopher Nolan's insistence on secrecy, led to a schedule where many of the Joker's most chilling scenes were filmed before the rest of the cast had even settled into their roles. Ledger delivered psychological extremes that no one could yet contextualize, performing scenes that appeared late in the story, long before the emotional groundwork had been laid. A catastrophic warehouse fire destroyed major sets, forcing Nolan to rebuild his schedule overnight. Key confrontations had to be shot in isolation, with actors uncertain about the emotional states leading into or out of the moment. Christian Bale frequently arrived on set, asking which Batman he needed to inhabit, the controlled strategist or the man unraveling under the Joker's chaos. Editors later recalled that the Joker's storyline felt like a mosaic of moods and tones, requiring meticulous care to shape into something coherent. But that very fragmentation became part of the film's power. The Joker's unpredictability, his sense of being an apparition slipping in and out of scenes, mirrored the fractured way he had been captured. Yet the next production would confront an entirely different challenge. Not secrecy, not disaster, but a director whose ambition stretched beyond the limits of time, structure, and physical endurance. Fact 6. Terminator 2: Judgment Day. James Cameron approached Terminator 2 with an almost militaristic drive, yet even his command couldn't tame the chaos that tore the shoot out of sequence. Locations opened and closed without warning, forcing the cast to leap between emotional milestones. Arnold Schwarzenegger filmed moments of the T-800's growing humanity before shooting scenes in which the machine was still mechanical and unyielding. Linda Hamilton had to portray Sarah Connor's psychological descent after already filming the scenes that showed her clawing her way back to stability. Production hopped between smelting plants, desert outposts, and hospital corridors, with no regard for narrative continuity. The script evolved constantly. As Cameron refined themes and character arcs, the continuity binders became unwieldy tomes, impossible to follow in real time. Crew members often joked that they were making 3 different movies simultaneously. But Cameron carried a fierce clarity about the story's emotional direction, fear giving way to trust, destruction giving way to sacrifice. When the fragments were finally assembled, they locked together with surprising precision. What emerged was not merely a coherent film, but a groundbreaking one, forged from chaos into something mythic. And if Cameron managed to wrestle chaos into harmony, the next production on this list would descend into a different kind of confusion, one created not by scheduling or sets, but by the narrative loops built into its very DNA. Fact 7: Edge of Tomorrow. Some productions lose their sense of orientation. Edge of Tomorrow surrendered its chronology entirely. Because the story hinges on repeated deaths and reset timelines, the shoot quickly devolved into a maze where no one could determine which version of the day the characters were living through. Tom Cruise performed the same moments across drastically different emotional states: fear, frustration, numb, resolve, sometimes within the span of a single morning. The exosuit's extreme weight only amplified the exhaustion. Doug Liman constantly reshaped scenes during filming, rewriting structure while cameras were rolling. Emily Blunt, shifting between Rita's hardened detachment and subtle mentorship, had to rely on instinct rather than a linear emotional path. Locations fluctuated unpredictably, forcing late-stage loops to be filmed before early ones had even been conceptualized. Continuity charts became so convoluted that the crew ceased updating them, relying instead on intuition and performance memory. Yet the fractured production echoed the very mechanic that defined the story: the disorientation, the emotional resets, the sense of characters trapped in narrative spirals. It all emerged naturally from the chaos. The film's final rhythm feels strangely deliberate, though its creation was anything but. And if time loops dismantled structure here, the next film would fall victim to something equally disruptive, a stunt so massive it forced an unfinished script to bend around it. Fact 8: Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. Most blockbusters build toward their most dangerous stunt. Rogue Nation opened with it. The now iconic Airbus sequence, Tom Cruise clinging to the side of a military aircraft as it lifts into the sky, was filmed before the script had settled into its final form. Because the plane was only available for a short window, the production had to begin with its climax, long before character motivations or story stakes had been fully defined. Christopher McQuarrie rewrote major portions of the plot to justify what had already been filmed. Injuries later forced Cruise to reshuffle additional scenes, plunging the narrative even deeper out of order. Romantic tension between the leads was shot before the characters had met on screen. Betrayals were captured before trust had been established. Much of the film's emotional undercurrent had to be constructed retroactively through editing. Paramount worried the project was being reverse engineered around set pieces rather than story, but McQuarrie, embracing the challenge, worked backward, structuring character arcs to fit the stunt-driven footage. The final product feels seamless, but the path to get there ran in the opposite direction of logic. And if Rogue Nation nearly buckled under its own spectacle, the next film confronted pressures from geography itself, where the storyline had to adapt to whatever roads Los Angeles offered on any given day. Fact 9: Speed. Few action films maintain a pure, forward-driving pulse like Speed, yet behind the camera, continuity fractured almost immediately. The availability of LA freeways dictated the shoot, not the script. Scenes meant for the film's escalating tension were captured out of order, leaving Keanu Reeves uncertain whether Jack Traven should be steady under pressure or moments away from unraveling. Sandra Bullock's early interactions with the crew were filmed before her character had naturally bonded with Jack, requiring her to adjust performance tone on instinct alone. Explosive set pieces, including the pivotal bus detonation, were sometimes filmed late in production, long after quieter emotional beats had been captured. Director Jan de Bont tried to maintain the illusion of rising suspense, but the schedule tore the emotional flow into disconnected pieces. The crew attempted detailed continuity maps, yet shifting locations made them obsolete within days. Despite the fragmentation, the film's jagged rhythm ultimately served its story. The tension, the urgency, the unpredictability, it all mirrored the chaos of the production itself. What should have undermined the film instead infused it with a raw, breathless momentum. And if Speed survived the disarray of its environment, the next production would face a different storm, conflicting tones, rewrites, and emotional reversals that tested a legendary duo's chemistry. Fact 1: Zero Lethal Weapon 2. The second installment of Lethal Weapon carried the franchise's trademark mix of chaos and charm, but behind the scenes, the turmoil was far less playful. Sudden weather shifts in Los Angeles forced the crew to seize whatever moments of sunlight appeared, regardless of where those scenes belonged in the script. Mel Gibson found himself jumping into Riggs's spiraling rage long before filming the quieter scenes that introduced his emotional state. Danny Glover, meanwhile, delivered Murtaugh's comedic beats after completing tense, draining sequences, leaving him unsure which tone he needed to embody from scene to scene. Script adjustments arrived almost nightly, driven by both studio intervention and unavoidable scheduling disruptions. The narrative's emotional progression twisted into something nearly untraceable. Even the continuity team, normally the safety net in productions like this, found themselves unable to maintain consistent emotional markers. Producers worried that the story's internal rhythm might collapse under the weight of these inconsistencies. And yet, when the footage was finally assembled, the fractured energy contributed to the film's raw spontaneity. The unpredictability woven into the production echoed the dynamic between Riggs and Murtaugh, two men barely keeping pace with the chaos around them. But while tone and weather shaped the instability here, the next film faced a more profound kind of fragmentation. A world divided into two realities, each imposing its own demands on an already disordered shoot. Fact 1-1, The Matrix. The creation of The Matrix demanded innovation on every level, but innovation seldom arrives without disruption. Keanu Reeves, recovering from a neck injury, had to film several physically demanding sequences early, long before the philosophical backbone of the story had been secured. Fight choreography was executed months before the quieter, reflective moments meant to give meaning to those battles. Lawrence Fishburne and Carrie-Anne Moss described days when they stepped onto set with no certainty about whether their characters were discovering truth or confronting consequences already known. Production zigzagged between the green-tinted digital world and the bleak industrial real world, depending entirely on which sets were ready. Bullet time shots, conceptual breakthroughs for the film, were captured before the story had naturally reached the point of Neo's awakening. With each shift, the emotional grounding slipped further out of sync. The Wachowskis revised their script and thematic elements throughout filming, refining existential questions and character motivation. Early scenes suddenly contradicted new ideas, triggering subtle reshoots and a complex editorial process. Editors worked with footage that felt like different iterations of the same universe colliding. Yet, in an almost uncanny twist, the fractured method amplified the narrative's core idea, a reality that doesn't reveal itself in order. Neo's confusion mirrored the production's instability, transforming chaos into a stylistic asset. But while The Matrix thrived on philosophical fragmentation, the next film encountered something far more tangible: the absence of a complete script, leaving actors to forge character arcs out of improvisation. Fact 2. Iron Man. It's difficult to imagine now, but the film that launched the Marvel Empire began with startling uncertainty. Iron Man entered production without a fully finished script, forcing Robert Downey Jr. to improvise many of Tony Stark's defining beats. Scenes were shot whenever a fragment of workable script surfaced, regardless of where those moments were meant to fall in Stark's emotional journey. Lighthearted exchanges were filmed before critical turning points had been established. Revelations came before the scenes that seeded them. Jon Favreau encouraged spontaneity, which created an appealing looseness in the performances but wreaked havoc on structural continuity. Gwyneth Paltrow and Downey often discovered their emotional cues on the spot, without the benefit of a coherent build-up. Meanwhile, action sequences were captured based on when effects, teams, and locations were available, further scattering the narrative. Marvel, inexperienced with productions of such scale at the time, worried they were betting their future on a film without a stable foundation. Editors later admitted they pieced the story together as though excavating something buried slowly, uncovering Stark's arc from a mass of disconnected scenes. Ironically, the improvisational chaos shaped Tony Stark's personality. His wit, unpredictability, and emotional volatility emerged naturally from a production defined by uncertainty. But if Iron Man was carried by improvisation and charisma, the next film on the list would rely on something more fragile: the delicate balance of a massive ensemble cast whose schedules threatened to tear the narrative apart. Fact 1-3. The Expendables. When The Expendables assembled some of the biggest names in action cinema, the excitement was immense, but so was the logistical nightmare behind the scenes. With actors spread across conflicting schedules, the production couldn't gather the entire team at once. Entire character scenes were filmed with stand-ins, only for the real actors to arrive weeks later and attempt to recreate the chemistry without the natural rhythm of interaction. Stallone, both director and star, juggled his own physical injuries while steering a ship held together together by fragments of availability rather than a cohesive plan. Fights were choreographed before a complete story existed. Jokes meant to grow organically were delivered long before the emotional groundwork was established. Some actors filmed scenes meant to appear in the finale, while others were still working through their earliest narrative beats. Stallone eventually had to reconstruct the team dynamic in the editing room, aligning mismatched performances into a single pulse. The end product carries a roughness that reflects this fractured creation, a sense of raw, unpolished camaraderie, born from necessity rather than design. It mirrors the mercenary spirit of the characters themselves, a group forged not through order but through trial. But if The Expendables faltered under sprawling schedules, the next film endured a more primal disruption, one driven by nature, politics, and constant instability. Fact 1 for Rambo, First Blood Part 2. Rambo, First Blood Part 2 was shaped as much by the jungle as by the filmmakers, shooting in Mexico's dense wilderness, where storms arrived without warning and humidity-warped equipment forced the crew to capture scenes whenever conditions allowed. Stallone shifted between Rambo's silent restraint and explosive fury at the mercy of weather, performing climactic rage long before filming the narrative seats that justified it. Political pressures compounded the instability. Studio executives demanded revisions that aligned with shifting geopolitical sentiments, prompting last-minute rewrites that contradicted scenes already shot. Emotional pivots were displaced, leaving actors unsure whether they were building toward a moment or reacting to one that hadn't been filmed yet. Continuity supervisors struggled to maintain emotional logic as the shoot bounced between tones and intensities. Yet, paradoxically, the fragmented structure fed into Rambo's portrayal, a man caught in a mental battlefield, torn between trauma and vengeance. The rough edges became part of the character's psychological texture. Still, this production, battered by weather and rewritten by politics, was not the most unstable on the list. The next film faced a more direct kind of threat, geopolitical tension so intense it reshaped the production day by day. Fact 1-5 Behind Enemy Lines. The making of Behind Enemy Lines unfolded under a constant shadow of volatility. Filming in Eastern Europe, close to regions still healing from conflict, meant locations could vanish from the schedule with only a few hours' notice. Director John Moore had to adapt on the fly, shooting whatever material the environment allowed, even if those scenes belonged to entirely different emotional phases of the narrative. Owen Wilson performed fear, fatigue, and frantic escape in a sequence that bore no resemblance to the chronological arc he was meant to follow. Gene Hackman's limited availability pushed his scenes to the very start of production, before the emotional stakes of the story had taken shape. As a result, the dynamic between command center and soldier, a core tension of the film, was built out of footage captured months apart under drastically different moods. Political sensitivities forced sudden narrative adjustments, motivations shifted, alliances changed, dialogue was rewritten hours before cameras roll. Editors later admitted the raw footage felt like parallel versions of the same story colliding, requiring surgical precision to reconcile. Yet, the final film's frantic pace and sense of perpetual danger emerged directly from this on-set instability. The production survived not by mastering chaos, but by channeling it, transforming disorder into momentum. Bonus fact: Hard Target. Some productions descend into chaos. Hard Target fractured into something stranger, almost mythic in its disarray. What unfolded behind the camera wasn't simply a shootout of sequence, but a clash of visions so profound that the film seemed to spawn multiple identities at once. John Woo arrived in Hollywood carrying the elegance and precision of his Hong Kong style, while Jean-Claude Van Damme stood firm on shaping the film around his own persona. Their creative tug-of-war rippled through every department, splintering the story before it ever had a chance to settle. Entire scenes were filmed only to be rewritten hours later, then filmed again with different motivations. Emotional beats were performed for character arcs that no longer existed by the next morning. Some of Woo's meticulously crafted action sequences, complete with doves, slow-motion flourishes, and balletic choreography, were captured long before the narrative structure to support them had been finalized. Other sequences were reshot under Van Damme's direction on days when Woo was pushed aside, doubling the film's contradictory voices. Editors described the experience as receiving pieces of three incompatible movies: Woo's operatic thriller, Van Damme's star-driven vehicle, and a studio-mandated Americanized version that arrived in scattered notes and re-edited footage. Continuity became irrelevant. One scene might reflect Woo's artistic vision, while the next would shift abruptly into Van Damme's improvisational energy. The final cut is less a cohesive film than a survivor of creative collision. Hard Target didn't simply shoot out of order, it was reshaped, torn apart, and rebuilt so many times that no single version of the story ever truly existed. It stands as a reminder that sometimes chaos doesn't just threaten a film, it becomes the essence of it. When you look closely at these productions, the illusion of control begins to fall away. What we call cinema is often the end result of 1,000 desperate corrections actors improvising their way through unfinished arcs, directors stitching emotions together from moments that were never meant to sit side by side, and editors trying to carve coherence out of fragments. These films survived not because the process was smooth, but because someone refused to let disorder win. So here's the question that lingers: which of these broken productions surprised you the most? And do you think the final films reflect intention or merely the best possible order carved from chaos?